Okay, welcome to week two, and we're just going to be going over chapter two this week, which is personality research and methods. Which again, we're just basically just how personality psychologists go about doing their research and what kind of data we specifically are looking for when we are doing research. So, some of the objectives. One objective is we're going to discuss the differences between scientific education and technical training. We're going to discuss the four ways to look at personality, and so this is different types of data that we might collect. The acronym we use is BLISS, which stands for Behavior, Life, Informant, and Self, and so we'll know exactly what each of those means and also some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. We're going to discuss the quality of each of these data and how do we get really clean data to use and things that we need to consider in order to really have high quality of research data. And last but not least, we're going to discuss three basic research designs. Now, this isn't the only type of research design, but these are probably the ones that are going to be used the most in personality psychology. So, first and foremost, let's talk about the goal of research. So, the goal of research is to continuously improve on tentative questions to answer to questions. So, the thing is that it's in this. The goal of research is not to necessarily settle anything definitely, and that's often misconstrued with some type of with a lot of people. Think of science as this ever evolving field where we're trying to get closer and closer to what the reality of the world is. Now, the issue is that we can never really fully get there. And so, therefore, we are continuously trying to improve what we know so that we can kind of chip away and get closer and closer to it. But we will always have these questions to be answered because it's almost impossible to get to the nature of truth. So the emphasis is going to be on the thinking and seeking of new information. That's really what we're looking for, is can we get new information that's going to give us closer to what we really want, and to learn how to question what we think we know and explore the unknown. So we want to be able to explore what we don't know and get, again, closer to that truth. So research is just the exploration of the unknown. And so in order to explore this unknown, we need to gather data. And the more data we gather, the better we're going to be. So we're in terms of psychology, and specifically for personality, this is going to kind of go back to what we were talking about, the psychological triad. So we're looking at things like a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and this is going to give us these personality clues, and this is where the data really is. And these clues are the observable aspects of personality, such as behaviors, scores, or responses to lab procedures. There's many different possible things that we can look at, but these are just little personality clues that we can kind of grab at and get closer to. And the thing is that these clues are going to be very ambiguous, and that kind of makes sense because personality can't be directly observed. It's not necessarily like a physics experiment where you put together a trebuchet that's going to throw it and you do the calculations and you figure out exactly where it's going to land. It's not like that. You can't fully observe it quite like a trebuchet. What you could do is you can observe certain qualities of a person, and the qualities give you these clues. And so the psychologist's job is to put all of these clues together, and interpret them and try to interpret them correctly to understand the personality. So there's no perfect indicator of personality. There's only clues, and these clues are ambiguous. And this is what we call Funder's law, the second law. Funder is the author of your book. If you remember, his first law was that a person's strength is often their weakness. The second one is that there's no perfect indicator of personality because it's ambiguous, and therefore we can only go off of those clues and how we interpret those. So, again, a psychologist's job is to gather as much as possible, put them together in a cohesive way. Now, his third law is something beats nothing 2 times out of 3. And what this means is that, you know, any type of data that we can gather is better than nothing. We don't want to just start making assumptions without any data whatsoever. So even if we can get just a little bit of information, that's better than nothing most of the time. Now, this is just like a fun little cartoon, but you can, and so I guess one man is talking to the other. Are you just pissing and moaning, or can you verify what you're saying with data? So I'm assuming that the person saying this is probably a researcher of some form, but maybe the cliche thought where people go and kind of go to a bar and they start saying, "Oh, my life is so hard. You know, nobody really likes me," or I'm never going to get these jobs, and he starts complaining about all these aspects. It's like, well, he's making a lot of assumptions. So you know, in this case, they're asking, well, where's the data to support that? Now, there's different types of data. If you remember, I said that the acronym BLISS. So there's what we call S data, which is the S part of BLISS. And this is going to be for self-judgments or self-reports. And these are usually gathered by questionnaires or surveys. What S data is it's a person's own evaluation of their personality. So you can gather this through things like self-ratings, which self-ratings are often matched descriptions from others. The best experts about a person's personality is often themselves. And so, you can get a lot of information by just asking a person about their personality, because a lot of times they know themselves best because they are constantly with themselves, right? So questionnaires and surveys have ratings and open-ended questions a lot of times. And so, for example, if I was to ask, I'm open to new experiences, how often is that true for you? You could probably answer, well, how open are you to new experiences? Well, I'm fairly open. Maybe I'm a 4 or a 5, right? Or maybe I'm not. I'm like, no, I like doing my own thing, so I'm more of a 1. There is these, when we do this types of questionnaires and surveys, there's actually a fairly high face validity which is defined by the degree to which an assessment instrument appears to measure what it's intended to measure. So in this case, you see it's saying, I am open to new experiences. So what this is, on the face value of it, it's trying to say, we're measuring how open you are. In this case, how open you are to new experiences, right? So this is actually a really nice way of having really high face validity when we do it this way. Now, there are some questions that are going to have less face validity. So, for example, on the MMPI, there's a question that is, I like mechanic magazines, or I read mechanic magazines. I forget which one it is, but that's going to be a little bit less face valid because you're not really sure exactly what they're asking in that question, right? But in this case, this has a high validity in this question, face validity. Now, the advantages of the S data, and again, this is like your self-report data, is that there's a large amount of information that can be gathered because you're always with yourself, so you know a lot of this information. If I asked you about how giving you are, you might be able to tell me a little bit about when the last time you gave something away, or you could tell me about how honest you are. You could tell me how how much you experience positive emotions, how much you experience negative emotions, right? So lots of, yourself, you're always there. And so people are usually their own best experts. Also, because it's yourself or the person that you're trying to study, because it's directly them, you have access to that triad that we talked about, right? So you have all of this access to the thoughts, feelings, and intentions that are not obvious to the person that's asking the question, right? And so that's really important that we can get to that kind of information from that direct source. And this kind of leads into that there's maybe like this definitional truth. The data are true by definition because it's coming directly from that person's self. So if I ask you questions about your self-esteem, if you answer those questions, it's like, well, this is directly coming from the source, so it's likely to be true. There's also this causal force, which is like self-perceptions that can create your own reality or truth and influence the goals people set for themselves. And so, what this is getting to somebody's self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is how capable you think you are. So you can get to like the causes of these forces that are happening. In this case, like how much do you think you can actually achieve, or can you affect your own goals that you've set for yourself, right? Or this can get into self-verification, which is where people work to convince themselves to treat them in manners that confirm their own conception. So in other words, you want somebody to act a certain way with you, so you're going to act in a certain way to get them to respond to it in that way. If that makes sense. And then also, this is simple and easy. A lot of times you're just asking those people those questions directly and getting those responses. So it's cost effective in a lot of ways. Now, there are some disadvantages to this, though, in that there's a lot of bias. And so, for example, people are generally going to not always be forthright with things that are overly positive or overly negative. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, if I was to ask you, how many people that you have had sexual intercourse with, some people might sit there and say, "Oh, I don't really want to tell the truth because I either feel self-conscious about how few or how many I've had." Either way, right? And so they may not give you the most effective answer, but a lot of times, it's going to be same thing with positive stuff as well, where in the positive way, it's like, well, if I'm very giving, am I going to be very forthright with that givingness? Like, you're usually pretty humble. If you give a lot of, you're very humble. And so if I ask you, are you a very generous person? You might be like, no, I could do more, right? When it's like you ask everybody around you, it's like, oh, no, that person was great. But you may not have that understanding about yourself, or you may not be forthright with that information. And this kind of goes for this same thing for like desire for privacy or faking. Like, again, some of these questions we're asking are going to be very private, and so they may not want to make themselves look better or look worse in some ways. They may be ashamed of their personality of some form, and so this enters some bias into the information that they're giving you. Additionally, there's some error that can be there. When it comes to self-report, you're looking at a person's ability to look at themselves. And so this creates a fish in water effect for some people. And what a fish in water effect is it's when people don't notice their most obvious characteristics because it's so obvious to you that maybe you don't even perceive it anymore. You're like, well, this is so normal for me. And because of that, I'm always like this. It's like I'm always surrounded by water, right? I'm always very generous, and so therefore this is the norm. It's like, no, this isn't the norm. You're actually a very generous person, right? And therefore it becomes less obvious to that person. Also, there's sometimes this active, it can be also inactive, but there's an active distortion of memory. Memory is not very good, right? And so sometimes you can distort a memory to match what you want to be perceiving of yourself. Maybe there's a little bit of this repression where you're trying to hide some of this memory, whatever it might be, but there could be some distortions that in your representation of yourself. And there's sometimes people lack self-insight, this ability to look at yourself through a certain lens and really kind of go, why do I do this? Why am I like this? And so this lack of insight is important to take note of because it can enter into error as well. And lastly, you have carelessness for the error part. And carelessness is that, sometimes when people are doing questionnaires, you're either answering them like, you might get careless and you just kind of note, I marked it 4 out of 5, and really it's actually 1 out of 5, but I misread it, or, I am just fatigued. That can happen too. You're taking a test for a long time and you're like, oh, I don't care anymore. It's just a 3. This is a 3, and you're not really putting a lot of thought into it anymore. So there's some carelessness that comes into it too. And then third, it can be too simple and too easy sometimes, which can be leads to overuse of this data, and that's also an issue. Now, I said bliss. So the S is the self data. The I is what we call informant report data. And this is I data is basically judgments by knowledgeable informants that could be people like acquaintances, your coworkers, other clinical psychologists, their friends, their family, right? All of these people that know anything about them. And so these are going to be people that just have knowledge of them. There's no necessarily training or expertise needed in talking to these people either. And they might be actually more accurate in a lot of ways to the self-judgment of that person, because they might be more of the person that's able to look at those extreme desirable or undesirable traits, right? So if all of a sudden I feel like, or if I don't want people to know that I'm not very agreeable, which means that I don't get along well with other people as much, right? Maybe if you ask me directly, I might be like, I get along good enough, right? But if I ask the people around you, I ask your coworkers, how agreeable is this person? And they might be way more likely to be like, oh yeah, no, they don't get along with most people, right? And so in some ways, it helps reduce some of that bias that a person might have about themselves, because here's somebody outside of this who does have that that judgment of that person. Same thing with like that humble example, right? If I ask you, oh, how generous you are, and you're a really generous person, it's possible that you sit there and say, well, I'm a generous person, but I don't really want to say I'm a generous person. But if I go up to the people that are active beneficiaries of that benefit, and I say, how generous is this person? Oh my gosh, Sarah, she's just so amazing. She's fantastic. I really love her because she gives with all her heart. She's the person that takes her shirt off her back and gives it to you, right? It's like that kind of thing. It's like, well, okay, these people probably are more accurate than the person that's being a little bit more humble. Right? And so when I say judgments, what I'm talking about is based on a person's evaluation of the observed person in the context of which they're known in, right? So keep that in mind, because that's actually important. The context is going to be important in just a few seconds. But this is used pretty frequently in daily life because, we sometimes might ask people for letters of recommendation, right? And so the reason that people ask for letters of recommendation is because they want to know a little bit more about you. How are you like to other people? Because if I'm applying to get into a school, I'm assuming that you're gonna want to put out this best foot forward. But if I ask somebody who knows you and they're recommending you, then I know, okay, this might be good. Same thing with gossip. I mean, how many of you have ever been involved in either participating in spreading, or maybe the person it is of gossip? And this is a lot of times people's perceptions of you that are being put forth. Now, there's obviously advantages, disadvantages of this as well. So, for example, there's large amounts of information out there that are informant based. This is great because you got your teachers, you have your friends, your family, your coworkers, your acquaintances, I don't know, whoever it is. There's lots and lots of people, and therefore there's lots of behaviors in many situations that are being exposed to other people that might be able to add some information, some data to create a personality inventory. And the more you can, the better it is probably going to be. Okay. Also, there's real world basis to this. These are real things that you've done in the community or in your lives, and they're not, under these weird circumstances like an experiment would be. These experiments are great because they do take care of a lot of constructs, but it's also artificial in some ways. And so this is not artificial. You get real world information. Again, and then another advantage is common sense, right? It takes so it takes context into the account. This is what I was talking about before, in that you know who you are in certain contexts is not necessarily who you are in other contexts. Who you are with your family isn't necessarily who you are at school, right? And so it's looking at these different contexts to try to figure out, oh, okay, how is this person different in different contexts? And we can ask people from those different contexts and get a better sense of who you are from a case-to-case basis, as well as this overarching theme that may be appearing as well. Right? And then also it kind of goes into this that same thing with self-report, where it's this definitional truth and causal force to it as well. So definitional truth being that some aspects of a personality are based on what others see you do or how they react to you. Like, for example, charm or likability, right? How charming are you? How likable are you? Those are kind of getting into the truth about who you might be. And then this causal force is like, well, because of your personality, what is the cause out of that? So what's your reputation? And that opens up what kind of personality opportunities you have. Sorry. So this reputation might open up or close opportunities, or what people expect from you, right? Based on your reputation. Are you going to be this reliable person, or maybe you're going to be the person that they go, you don't go to them if you need help. You go to this person, right? But what do people expect about you? And so that's, again, that goes into what people expect, and then also the behavioral confirmation. So confirmation of like, well, is this person actually the way that they're presenting themselves? Now, there are disadvantages as well. So for one, a lot of these times these people have limited behavioral information. Acquaintances often see only you in one context, and people might be different in different contexts. So, because of that limiting factor, you can't really gauge the entirety of it, because it's, well, there's different contexts. You're going to behave differently. There's lack of access to private experiences in this case, right? Because they're limiting. When you're by yourself, nobody has knowledge about how you are, what your personality is like when you're alone. And you still have a personality even when you're alone, but you can't gather that from informant data or eye data. There's also a lot of error in that people are more likely to remember behaviors that are extreme, unusual, or emotionally arousing. I kind of go back to that example of the letter of recommendation. Most of the time, people that are willing to write you a letter of recommendation are going to see you in this very positive light, right? And this is kind of this creates this recommendation effect where they're only telling you the good things about a person, and maybe that's because the things that are sticking out to them are all of these really great things that you've done, but they didn't really remember some of the ones that were not so great because they weren't terrible, but they were just average, but they were looking at the extremes of the times that you were really stuck out to them, right? And it's also open to prejudice and stereotypes, unfortunately. And so that's also a problem. So, there's some bias there due to like personal issues, like secretly loving or hating that person, or some prejudice, like if somebody, it might be sexist or racist to some level, right? And that can feed into those biases as well. So here's an example, and the nice thing about both S data and I data, so self data and informant data, is that a lot of times you can kind of use the same methods of retrieving information. So I could easily go up to a person and say, hey, I want you to answer this Likert scale. So this scale of 1 to 9, 9 being most, 1 being least, where is critical, skeptical, or easily impressed, right? So I can ask you, hey, are you critical, are you skeptical, or easily impressed? Where are you on a scale of 1 to 9, right? Or I could go up to your parent or guardian and I can say, hey, is your kid skeptical, critical, or easily impressed? Just as easily, and ask them kind of the same way, which is really nice, especially for gathering data, is that that you can kind of modify and still get nice personality ratings in this way. Now, the L in BLISS is life outcomes data. And this is going to be like verifiable or concrete or real life facts that hold psychological significance, right? And so this is going to be obtained through like archival records or self-report. So for example, right here, if I was to go into and ask you, hey, I want to see your room. I want to see where you live, right? And all of a sudden I walk into your room and maybe your room looks more like this, or maybe your room looks like this, right? So on the right hand side, it's really organized, and it seems like maybe this person's more conscientious to some level, right? But you can gather, okay, this person's very organized, they're very tidy, maybe they have those types of qualities, and this person's a little bit more relaxed or a little bit more or less organized, should I say, right? And so this is like, okay, I'm looking at archives, I'm looking at things that you've done and figuring out, okay, what is it about a person, and you can gather a lot of information, right? So like so other types of L data is like how much you make, right? I can say, okay, how much do you make, and how often do you visit a doctor? What are your grades like? Those are all archival information about you, and it might spell out some things about you. And what's nice about this is it's not really prone to the biases that self-data and informant data have. But there's also some disadvantages as well. For example, it might be difficult to access or use of this information might violate some sort of privacy, and so there's some disadvantages here too. But this is actually how the good part about this is the result of your personality oftentimes, right? The result of your personality might give us indicators of, well, how much do you make? This result of your personality might indicate, well, how are your grades? Or so it's how a person has affected the world and how that's played off of each other, and that's life outcomes. So a lot of times people will think of this as like a residue of your personality, right? So maybe this person is more conscientious, meaning they're more organized and more conscious about where things are, and this person's less, and those are going to impact how you're interacting in the world, and therefore that's the residue of your personality. So here's just some other examples. So your age might be an indicator of, and this is a type of life data. Your gender, the amount of money, which I said, right? The amount of days of work or school that you've missed, your grade, the number of miles you traveled, your bedroom neat or tidy, are you married, do you hold a passport? These are all types of data that we can use to unveil a little bit about your personality. And so, like I said, there's some advantages, right? In this case, it's objective and it's verifiable. So there's not those biases that we talked about earlier. And there's some of this intrinsic importance, meaning this is like what the psychologist needs to know. So, what are your criminal behavior? What's your employment status, success at school, or what people are trying to affect, right? So, are they trying to affect their parole officer arrest record, or their doctor, or the number of hospitalizations they've had? And so there's some psychological relevance here. L data are usually affected by and uniquely informative about psychological variables. For example, conscientiousness is needed to hold down a job. If you're less conscious about things, generally people that are really low in conscientiousness have a hard time keeping a job, whereas people that are high in high conscientiousness is going to hold the job pretty well. And then there's some disadvantages too, in that it's multi-determination, right? So an outcome has many causes, right? A lot of times, when we look at this stuff, you can gather some information, but you have to understand that the outcome might have a lot of causes. And L data can be influenced by a lot of things, more than just their personality, right? So a genetic illness that doesn't necessarily impact your personality, but it still matters, or your parental attention, or environmental toxins, right? All of these can be things that bleed into those L data that you might see. So determining the connections between L data, that life data, and personalities can get tricky, right? And that's a kind of a problem. So so obviously we have that BLIS, right? So BLIS. L is life data, I is informant data, S is self data, B is behavioral data. And behavioral data is information that is carefully and systematically recorded from direct observation. And that's what's important here, is that this is going to be direct observation of a person, or at least systematically recorded. And we'll talk a little bit about what's the difference between direct observation and systematic records. But this is going to be the most visible part of your personality. Somebody actually watching you in this naturalistic setting and observing, what you do on a daily life or in a lab. What do you like in person? And there's lots of different personality tests that require this type of data. Not all personality tests do, but certain types do. And actually, when it comes to like certain diagnosis of, and obviously this is not a clinical psychology class, but different diagnosis will look at this as well. Oop. There we go. Whew. Froze on me for a second. Okay. Now, the great news about B data, or that behavioral data, is that it's real life setting. This is what's really happening. And you can get this by either observing, but you can also do this through this, like I said, that systematic records. So you can give diaries or experience sampling methods in it. And so you can do electronically activated records. You can do wearable cameras. There's lots of ways that you can actually do this. You can go to an ambulatory assessment, which is like using computer assistant methods to gather that information, right? But there's lots of different ways that we can gather this type of data. Social media is a good way of doing this as well. So tracking social media, and so these are lots of different ways of going about this. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages here too. Like, for example, an advantage, realistic, right? Descriptions of what the participants actually do in daily life can be observed, right? So we are actively going to their daily life. We are going to describe what we see, and that's great. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that it's difficult for a lot of reasons. So one way that it's difficult is that it is, well, it's kind of hard to get people to act normal when they know they're being observed. Have you ever been, typing on the computer, and all of a sudden your boss or your teacher, or even if you're doing homework, and your roommate comes over and looks over your shoulder and watches you type, and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I can't behave like I'm like, oh no, I don't even remember how to spell the word "the," right? It's like, oh no, I've lost all ability to do things, right? Sometimes we act differently when we know we're being watched. So that's how it can be difficult. And also, like, desired context seldomly occur when we're doing this. So if we wanted to know, okay, in an emergency situation, how are you going to act? When we do this, we're kind of crossing our fingers saying, well, hopefully there'll be an emergency situation and we'll be able to look and see it do this. But realistically, we can't like artificially make an emergency situation, because that would be highly unethical, right? And so sometimes what we want to observe, we actually can't in this way. And so that becomes a problem too. Another way we can do this though is through like experimentation, right? What this we try to this is when we actually do try to artificially make something. And so we make a situation happen and we record the behavior. Probably not something unethical like an emergency situation, but we could put people in different situations and see how they react to those situations. And so this represents real life context, or we hope it does. But the problem is that we're actually not sure. Right? Even though we think this might be real life context, it's difficult to really know exactly if it will be or not, and that's a kind of adds some difficulty. Also, there could be like this physiological measures as well. So there's biological behavior that happens that we need to keep in matter. So we can measure things like blood pressure, or we can look at heart rate or galvanic skin responses. We can look at those as well in experimentation, which is really great. And this is also some behavioral data that we can observe as well. But again, even laboratory data has advantages, disadvantages. I've already named some, but advantages that there's a range of context. You don't need to wait for that situation because you're going to artificially create it. There's an appearance of objectivity because a lot of times when we do an experiment, we're holding things constant, which is great because there's less distortion and less exaggeration, and there's usually a high level of reliability and precision that goes into it. But subjective statements must be made, right? That's important, and so subjective statements decide which behaviors to observe and which and how to rate them. And so when we're doing a laboratory experiment, we have to be subjective about the judgment, and we have to make sure that we're certain we're interpreting that data in a certain way. There are some disadvantages though. Like I said, it's difficult and it's expensive because you're following a person around, or you're buying those stuff for the experiment, or you're buying body cameras so that they can wear them and walk around. And also, you're kind of uncertain about those interpretations. Behaviors may not mean what we think they do. If somebody gives you a gift, does that gift reveal that they're really generous, or that they like you? Or maybe it's more of that they feel the necessary pull for some sort of social laws that they're doing, and it has nothing to do with how they want to be generous, but how they want to be perceived themselves, right? So when we look at these behaviors, it doesn't necessarily mean what we think they might mean. So taking this all together, we got BLISS, right? We have behavioral data, we have life data, we have informant data, we have self data. Most of the time, data doesn't always fit into one category. You might have even started to see that in some of the things we've said here. For example, if we want to look at life data and we look at somebody's social media, right? And so we can label that as life data to some degree because, well, this is what you've posted. But it's also, to some level, going to be behavioral data because what are you posting about? What are the things that you're doing? That's things that we can actively observe you do. And it can also be informant data because of how people respond to you on those things, or it could be self data because it's what you put on there, right? So that's one category that fits into different categories and multiple types of data within that. So there's a wide range of possible ways that those integrate with each other, and so just to keep that in mind. But each type has those advantages and disadvantages that we talked about. And so even though that these don't cleanly fit into one type of data point, but it's just things to consider that, well, how many data points do they fit into? So here's just an overview of those. Again, BLISS, B-L-I-S. BLISS is behavioral, L is life, I is informants, and S is self-reports. So it's important that you'll probably need to remember that. So let's discuss quality of the data, because the data needs to be of high quality if we want to use it. And so we want to discuss first reliability. Reliability meaning that the measurement that is reflected over and over again. So if you retest, are you going to get the same outcome in repeated occasions? And so that way allows for some sort of comparative information, right? And so we look at measurement error in this case, also called error variance. Measurement error is the cumulative effect of extraneous influences on a test score. So, like an error variance would be, oh, I'm so open to new experiences, but forgets all the times that you were not, right? And so you need to account for some sort of this error variance where, okay, I think I'm open, but I might forget certain ones. So you got to account for that. And then same thing with effective extraneous influences. Sometimes things outside will influence how we are. And so these can impact how reliable these measures are. Another one to consider about our data and reliability is something happening because there's a state that a person's in, or is it because it's a trait? And so the best way to illustrate this is like, let's say that I give you a test on how social you are, right? Or I want to observe. I want to do B data, and I'm going to observe how social you are on a day-to-day basis. And the day that I come in is a day that you are feeling under the weather. So when you're feeling sick, that's a state you're in. That's not a trait. A trait would be something that's more that follows you around. It's more finite. It's something that is usual for you always. A state is going to be a smaller sample of that. It's going to be a smaller snippet of your life that is a state that you're currently in. So if you're feeling sick, right, you're in a certain state, which is an illness, which is usually smaller duration than a trait would be. And so if I come to watch you on a day that you're feeling sick, a lot of times when you're sick, there's this protective element to being sick, in that a lot of times when you're feeling sick, you don't really want to be around too many people, which is why, if you've ever been this person or you've had this person, they might be like, hey, I'm not feeling well, I don't think I'm going to come out tonight, right? It's maybe they are usually social, but the problem is that there's differences in the expected level of stability in terms of what are considered extraneous influences or sources of measurement error with traits. And so in this case, the person might not be as social in this case because they're feeling sick. It's important to note that all measurements are going to have some form of error, right? And so that's important too. Okay. So there's also some factors that will undermine reliability. So low precision is one of those factors, and so precision is what makes measurements precise or exact. And so sometimes when we're asking a question, we're trying to get to this like exactness, but it's not always possible. And so sometimes the way that we ask something has might be misinterpreted, and that can influence that reliability. It also kind of goes into that state factor. The state of a participant will matter, right? Like in the example I just gave of a person being sick, and actually they're very social, but because they're feeling sick, they may be less social when we're observing them. But also the state of the experimenter, because the experimenter generally is the person that's interpreting it, and depending on your state, maybe you're feeling sick and you're misinterpreting what's happening, right? Because you're not feeling good and you're like, oh, and so that might play a factor in it too. And there's variation in the environment as well. So things like the temperature of the room. If something is ungodly hot, if you go into a room and it's really hot, right? You're like, oh, I want to get out of here as fast as I can because I'm sweating and I don't like it. It might influence how you behave. Right? Same thing with the weather or the noise in a building. Things like that can impact. So how do we enhance our reliability? Well, we can be very careful. We can double check our measurements, we can check data entry, we can check accuracy of our scoring, so we can have multiple scores. That's another way, right? Lots of things that we can do. We can use a constant or scripted procedure. So, when a person comes in, we'll read off of a script, and that way we know that we're saying the exact same thing to everybody, and that way the hope is that the interpretation is not as wild because you're saying the same thing to everybody. Um, you can measure something that is important and engages participants, right? Do you care about healthcare debate? If you do, then your opinion will be more easy to measure reliably than if you don't care, because your opinion on those is likely to be influenced by whatever anybody else says around you, because you just don't care and you're just going to parrot what they say instead of come up with your own kind of interpretation of it. And that happens a lot too. The other thing that we can do is we can aggregate. Aggregate means that we're going to average different measurements. So we can use multiple measurements that contain, and so each of them might contain some error, but the idea is that if we get more, it will be able to suss out some of that error. What we can also do in this case is we can use what we call the Spearman-Brown formula in psychometrics. This is more nitty-gritty, but it's a mathematical formula that predicts the degree of which the reliability of a test can improve by adding more items. And so, you run this test, and basically you might say, oh, okay, it might be better if I add 2 more questions or something along those lines, right? So you can run different tests that might help you from like a statistical standpoint. And this is really important for predicting behavior, because single behaviors are influenced by many factors other than just personality. What influences whether you make a bed in the morning, right? So what are the things that make you make your bed in the morning? Lots of things, right? So for example, maybe it's your consciousness. So maybe you're very organized. Maybe it's that you woke up late, right? And normally you do, but today you didn't because, oh man, my alarm clock didn't go off, or my charger is frayed and didn't charge properly and my phone died during the night, or whatever else it is. There's lots and lots of things that might influence it. So it's really important to get an aggregation of different data, so that we're not just looking at one single behavior necessarily. Also, there's validity. And validity is the degree of which a measurement actually measures what it's supposed to. So are we measuring what we want to? And so something can be reliable, and which is having that repeatability, and it can be valid. Valid is, are we measuring what we want to? And this is slippery. This is not exactly like the easiest one, because reliability isn't necessary enough, or it's not sufficient enough to guarantee validity. What do I mean by that? So if something is reliable, it doesn't mean that it's valid. So if it's you get the measurement over and over again, it doesn't mean that it's measuring what you want it to. For example, if I wanted to, I know this has less to do with personality, but more to do with intelligence. But let's say that I want it to measure intelligence. And I thought, okay, I'm going to measure intelligence by measuring everybody's skull or their brain size, right? If I measured your skull or your brain size today, and then I measured it tomorrow, and then I measured it the next day, it's probably going to be reliably the same, unless something has happened, unless you've hit your head somehow, right? But reliably, it will probably be the same. But that is not a valid way of measuring intelligence. Measuring your skull and measuring your brain size is not a good way of measuring intelligence. And so that's what this means, is that validity is actually asking, are we measuring what we want to measure? Whereas reliability is just saying, do we get the same results over and over again? And so we're looking for both of them. And so this invokes the idea of this ultimate truth. But personality constructs cannot be seen directly. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's difficult, or it's actually like more impossible to know what constructs, intelligence or honesty really are, right? Because those are more abstract, right? So it's difficult to know if they are measured validly, right? So we try really hard to construct this validation, and the way we construct this is by gathering as many measurements as possible, and also having a strong definition of what we're trying to look for, right? So things that cannot be directly seen or touched, but affect or help to explain things that are visible, like gravity, right? But so we want to define these things, and then the strategy is to establish the validity through the measurements. Because of that, we've established that construct definition, we can then create kind of measurements, and then we kind of garnish those together, aggregate them together, and we get a nice little output. When it comes, though, we want it to be very generalizable when we gather data, because we want to be able to say, okay, this is how it is for most people. But this is kind of hard, though. And so this is so the distinction between reliability and validity is regarded as fuzzy by some. How much can a test be changed before it becomes a different test altogether? And assessments of reliability become assessments of validity, right? It's hard to know. And so there's a broader concept of reliability and validity that needs to happen. And so we want to be able to extrapolate this to a wider range of people. And so generalizability is the degree of which a measurement or a result of an experiment can apply to other tests or situations or people. Now, I will say that in psychology has been dominated by what we call weird populations. And weird is an acronym. It stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Societies. So most of it, and this is well documented, most of psychology, especially the groundbreaking psychology, meaning like the grassroots of it, are going to be biased in that they account for mostly college students. A lot of the older one is going to be mostly males, mostly white males, and therefore, can we really take that data and extrapolate it and say this is true for every population? Maybe not. Maybe not, right? And so we have to understand that, like, when we are reading things or if we're looking at things, if we're comparing it to an old stat, well, maybe we're comparing oranges to apples instead of apples to apples or oranges to oranges, because they're different types of populations, right? So that's something that we want to consider as well. So lastly, I want to just touch on some of the different research. Sorry, there's a plane flying over me, so you probably might hear that. I guess it's a helicopter. Anyways, so lastly, I want to discuss different research designs that are used. One that's highly used in clinical work is case methods. And this is where we look at a particular person or event or some sort of very, very specific situation. And we look at it in very, very big detail and deep detail, right? And so there's some advantages to doing this. It describes the whole phenomenon. Because you're only looking at the situation, you can look at it through every lens in the book, and it's very much just about that phenomenon. And it's a good source of ideas because it can generate those hypotheses when we do this. When think of if you think of which is HB, or like the HB was the I believe it's HB. Who had the head trauma with the hippocampus. So this guy had gotten into an accident on a bicycle at one point, and he had severe seizures. They ended up going and lobotomizing part of him so that he would stop having those seizures, but they ended up lobotomizing the hippocampus. And it turns out that he could remember everything up until the point of the surgery of the lobotomization, but he couldn't remember anything past that. And we're looking at him in very, very fine details. Now, it's great because what it did is it was a great source of ideas, right? We looked at that situation and we said, okay, what part of the brain did they take out? They took out the hippocampus. That means that the hippocampus is probably involved in memories. So then we have this nice little hypothesis. So these case methods are great for generating hypotheses, and they're necessary for understanding an individual. In this case, it would have been HB, right? That's great. There are some disadvantages, though, in that because we're only looking at one, that generalizability, that ability to extrapolate it and compare it to more populations, may not be quite as relevant, right? So that's kind of one of those problems. Now, I went ahead and I put the whole definition of what an experiment is on here, right? So an experiment is different than a case method, because an experiment is basically going to be looking for independent and dependent variables as they relate to each other, right? And so, the definition is on the slide because it is so long, but it highlights the importance of random assignment too. And so the definition is a research technique that establishes the causal relationship. And causal is important because causal means the cause. Something has caused this relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable by randomly assigning. So you have to take participants and randomly put them into different types of variable situations in the experimental group, characterized by different levels of the x, which in this case is independent variable, and by measuring the average behavior of y, the dependent variable that results in each group. So an example of this would be like if I want to measure, the impact that teaching style has on GPA, right? And so for my independent variable, that would be my teaching styles. And so I might say for one teaching style, it will be asynchronous work. So you're going to be working independently like you are. And for another one, it's going to be synchronous work, which is you're in a class with a teacher, and then you have synchronous online. So you have online with a teacher. And we want to say, how do each of these different groups impact GPA? And so the GPA would be our dependent variable, where the teaching style would be our independent variable. And we're going to randomly assign people into each of those different conditions. So that would be kind of an example of an experimental design. So it's going to test the differences between groups with statistical tests to determine the difference is larger than it would be expected by chance. Now, I know a lot of people have a hard time remembering which one's independent and dependent variable. And so here's how I usually remember it. And this is like the quick and dirty, easy way to remember it. I usually plug it into this little sentence. The effect of blank on blank. So the effect of teaching styles on GPA, right? So the first part of this is always going to be your independent variable, and the second part is always going to be your dependent variable. So the effect of teaching styles on GPA, teaching styles, your independent variables, dependent variables going to be your GPA. Right? So that's the easiest way I can explain how to remember which one is going to be the independent variables, the variables you're going to be putting people into different groups on, or the dependent variable, which is the outcome from those. So here's another example, and we can kind of use that same sentence, but we have let's say that we want to measure, if I put you into a room with puppies versus a room that's empty, will you get depression? So the effect of a puppy room on depression. So in this case, the independent variable will be rooms of puppies or no puppies, and the dependent variable is going to be depression, right? We got depression here. And so we will need to have a measurement of some form, which in this case we'll use the PHQ-9, which is you don't need to memorize that, but that's just a quick measurement of depression, right? And so we'll randomly assign some people into a room that's just filled with puppies, and we'll have another room that's filled with no puppies, and we'll see how depressed those people are afterwards, right? Oh my goodness. I hope you guys don't have to hear all that noise in the background, but there are a lot of motorcycles driving by, and they are noisy. So take a second, breathe, and then, okay, now we're good. Okay, so the last one that I want to consider is correlational studies. And we measure those with, if we're plotting them, we'll use what we call a scatter plot, and I'll show that in just a moment. But a scatter plot basically is going to look at it's basically a chart where each point represents an individual score on two variables, and they match up, right? Um, and so we'll either look at it through a scatter plot where we can visually see it, or maybe we come up with the correlational coefficient, and this is a number, and it's a number between -1 and 1. That reflects the strength and the direction of the relationship. So if you remember, hopefully, or if you're taking any type of statistics course or research methods course, a negative number represents a negative relationship, and a positive relationship is in the positive numbers. And the closer to 1, either that being -1 or 1, is the strength. So it'll be stronger as it gets further out, and then it'll be weaker as it gets closer to 0, that number. Anyway, so a correlational method, though, is a research technique that establishes a relationship between two variables by measuring both variables as they occur naturally in a sample of participants. So we're just looking at the relationship. Is there a relationship between these? We're not looking particularly at what is the relationship. We're just asking, is there a relationship? So again, the question is there a relationship, not what is the relationship? And so here we have, in this case, I guess they're looking at perceived power, so how much power a person holds, either through self-report, or maybe this is through somebody else's idea of what this person is, and their interpersonal sensitivity. And so let's say that you think of yourself as very, very powerful, so you're a 6. And then you find that your sensitivity to interpersonal things is rather high, or is like an 85. So you would put your little plot here. That would be you. And we looked at your roommate, and your roommate goes, I don't really feel like I have a lot of power. I'm a 2. And they say, but I feel like my interpersonal sensitivity is like a 75. So then this would be their plot. And we will look at lots and lots of different people, and it eventually will just have a lot of different dots on the page. And what we can do is we can combine those measures together to create this little line that we see here. And this is like an imaginary line, but basically what it's doing is it's averaging all of these out to create this line. And what we'll use is a correlational coefficient to come up with this number right here. So in this case, the relationship between power and interpersonal sensitivity is 0.25. So it's a positive relationship, meaning that when one goes up, the other goes up. Whereas if it's an inverse relationship or a negative relationship, one would be going down while the other one's going up. But it's 0.25, which is relatively weak. But there is a relationship. It's just kind of a weak one. So that would be how we would do that. Now, when we want to compare between experimental and correlational methods, we have to remember that both of them might be using two variables. So both will actually be looking at multiple variables, right? The difference, though, is, and I guess you could interchange them, but the difference is that experimental methods are going to manipulate one variable and hold one constant. And that's the big difference. So you're going to be manipulating your independent variables, and the dependent variable you're just going to measure afterwards. And correlational relationships, when you're doing a correlational method, you don't do that. You're not going to manipulate anything. You're just going to record. So you're just measuring. So correlational methods are just measuring those variables, whereas experimental methods are going to manipulate those variables. Okay? It's important to know, though, that statistics are interchangeable, though. So you can actually use different statistics for correlation and experiments, but it's how the part that you have to be very, very careful about is how you interpret them. Because if you're doing a correlational measure, you can only say that there's a relationship or not a relationship, and the type of relationship, but you can't say how they're related. So very, very important. So experiments can assess causality. And you might have heard the saying, correlation correlation does not measure causality, right? So experiments measure the cause and effect, correlations don't, right? Reasons are not knowing. So you don't know why there's a relationship. You just know that there is a relationship with correlations. Experiments, you can know what caused the other. The reason that we can't know, so we can't have a causal direction with correlational studies, is because there's a little bit of problems with the interpretation. When we're looking at correlations, again, we're only looking at, are these things related? We don't ask how. And so we can't say one caused the other. One reason is called the third variable problem. And what that might look like is this. We know that there's a relationship between eating ice cream and shark attacks. So the more ice cream you eat, the more likely you are to be attacked by a shark. And that's true. We know that. There's a relationship. If we wanted to do a correlational coefficient, so that statistical design of looking at the relationship of how much consumption of ice cream a person has versus how likely they are to get attacked by a shark, you'll find that there's a positive correlation. There's a relationship where the more ice cream you eat, the more likely you are to get attacked by a shark. But there's probably a third variable problem here. So there's a third variable besides ice cream and shark attacks that are influencing both. And in this case, that third variable is how hot it is outside. And so if it is a hot day, you are more likely to eat ice cream. And if it's a hot day, you're more likely to go into the ocean to cool off. If you're in the ocean because you're cooling off, you're more likely to get attacked by a shark. If it's a hot day, you're more likely to eat ice cream. So even though these have a relationship together, it's tied together by, well, what is the temperature like outside? And we call that a third variable problem. And so this is why we can't say definitively one causes the other. We just know that there's a relationship there. Another problem is that we don't know the direction of the cause. So we can measure, how much video game violence there is with how violent or a kid is going to be. And so we might ask the question, well, which direction is the cause? So is it that violent video games cause kids to be more violent? Maybe. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's that violent kids are more drawn to violent video games. So that's an unknown direction. And so, the importance here is that we don't know which direction. What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? And so with correlational studies, we can't know the cause. But with experiments, we can. So what we could do in this situation, when it comes to like an experiment, is we might take a bunch of kids, randomly assign them to play video games that are violent, randomly assign them to video games that aren't, and see if the kid becomes more violent after playing the video game. They've done this. We know that actually it's probably more that violent kids are more drawn to violent video games. It's not really that violent video games cause kids to. But I hope this illustrates how that direction of cause is important. Now, I will say that there's complications with experiments. There's uncertainty about what's really being manipulated. So manipulations may affect a variable other than the one intended, right? So maybe you're measuring competence instead of power, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And there's also a version of the third variable problem here, in that manipulation may have affected an unintended variable, and this affect both variables of interest. So people are more confident, may feel more powerful, and also have a higher interpersonal sensitivity like that, right? So maybe that's the case. This can create unlikely or impossible levels of variables. Results in exaggerated group differences. If a person has all the power and the other one doesn't, right? Maybe there's correlational studies measure natural levels more precisely. So things like that matter. And often require deception in experiments, which is not always great. You don't want to always have to deceive people. And it's not always possible to do experiments. That's just the nature of it. This is especially true with personality. So experiments are rarely used with personality psychologists. A lot of times we're looking for correlations, or we're looking for those case studies, because it's hard to create an experiment for personalities. Um, and then experiments aren't always better. That's the reality of it. A lot of times they're great. A lot of times people think of them as gold standards, but if you're not, if an experiment isn't designed well, or if the construct isn't well defined, then it's not really a great experiment to begin with. So an ideal research program involves probably both designs. You want to look at the correlational, and you want to see some experimental too. With that, I am done with this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or get in contact with me, and I'd be happy to answer any of them. And good luck this week. Thank you.